So in this chapter, we're looking at chapter 13, which again is looking at positive externalities in public goods. So in this, what we'll look at is the first part. It says why the private sector underinvests in innovation. So whereas last chapter we talked about pollution, this part 13.1 is going to it'll introduce the positive externalities. And a lot of this will be very similar to what we saw last week. The key differences will be we're messing with the demand curve instead of the supply curve, and instead of overproducing, the market will actually underproduce. We'll see all this as we go through. So we have why we underinvest or we introduce our positive externalities. The second bit, how can the government encourage innovation? So tools to basically increase our output. That is, we're going to see this externality and we're going to see this that we underproduce in this case. How can we get up to that socially optimal outcome? And then public goods is kind of getting a little bit in the public economy. We're looking at how do these goods work and how can we have them. And one of the big things we'll be getting into today is technology, just because we're going to see that with technology, it's very easy for somebody to develop something, then somebody else to come along and steal it or rip it off from whoever made it. So the big thing we're looking at today is new technology, innovation, and so on. And a couple other applications. I think we can education a little bit. So in the past, I've said education is a positive externality. There is a positive externality associated with education. We'll see why that happens, and maybe even why that positive externality isn't necessarily because of the education, but rather it could be a signal of people who choose to go to get educated. Again, we'll get into that as we go through. And so there's a little bit of a potential logical fallacy for that can easily stem from this chapter. So, like I said today, so when we think about positive externalities compared to our negative, we're going to be on the other side. So instead of thinking about the costs, we're going to think about the benefits that a good brings. So we'll have our private benefits, and this is again going to be that market. It's going to look like the market demand curve, but in this case, it's going to be the benefit of a person who actually consumes the good or receives the service. That is, this is going to end up looking like what the market demand curve. Then we have, just like before, we had our private costs and our social costs. Now we have our private benefit and our social benefit. That is what is the value of the positive externalities plus the value of the private benefit or the firm that developed the technology. So in this case, private benefits plus external benefits is our social. And what we're going to see come up with in this chapter is a positive externality or a benefit. And this positive externality, just like with the negative externality, is that spillover to the third party that benefits the third party instead of harming them. So with the negative externality, we said pollution makes the air not as great. It can hurt your property values. A positive externality will do just the opposite. Maybe it makes you healthier. Maybe maybe there's something that you benefit from a certain action being taken that you have nothing to do with. And that's what positive externality is going to look like. So graphically, what this looks like is going to be something like this. So for goods, we'll come in, we'll have dollars on the left and quantity of goods on the right. And we're going to see our initial demand curve look something like this. Right, we have our demand, and I'm going to say this is our market demand. Right, so our initial demand curve, the one we've been looking at throughout the entire course, is our private demand or our private benefit of producing the good. The idea again being that if the benefit is greater, and I'll put in the supply as well. So if the benefit is greater than the cost, I'm going to go ahead and consume the good. And same thing as I go down, 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 down. As long as this benefit is better, oops, you can't see that. As long as this benefit is better than the cost down here, uh, we're going to consume. So that's where we get to our equilibrium. But when we have added benefit, what we're going to see is we're going to see what's going to appear to be the demand curve. There we go. It'll appear to be the demand curve shifting over to the right. So we'll have our, we could call this demand social, but I'm going to call this the social benefit. And then down here, instead of calling it the market demand for now, we are going to call this the private benefit of consuming the good. And just like with the negative externalities, if I were to look at one individual point, I'd have something here, and then something here. So in green, in this case, I have my private benefit. In red, up here, we have our externality. And then if we add them together, we have the social benefit. Cool. So we have that, and that's what we're looking at this week, and how things work. So as we keep on analyzing this, and I'll get rid of the arrows but leave the colors, that way it stays color-coded. But with this, just like with our negative externalities, we're going to see two equilibriums. One will be down here, and another will be up here. And they will look just like they did before. So down here we'll have the quantity of goods the market produces, and up here we'll have our socially optimal quantity. So again, QM is what the market is, our market equilibrium, right? Really nothing surprising. And QS will be that socially optimal outcome. That is, as a society, we want to be at QS, and that includes, again, that includes everybody in society. So that includes those who benefit a lot from this, that includes those who benefit a little, and so on. So we have our socially optimal outcome, and what we'll see happen with our, oops, what did I just do? Cool. And we'll see happen with the positive externality is that, so if, oh, oops, excuse me, just like before. So last week we also introduced market failure. So in this case, again, since our social supply or social quantity is not equal to our market quantity, we, oops, I can spell that right. We have a market failure. To the magnitude of QS minus of our social quantity minus our market quantity. And just like before, our goal is going to be, the overall goal in dealing with positive externalities is to close that gap. And what we'll see happen as we go through is instead of punishing people, whereas before we had taxes, we said, oh, you have to clean up. Now we want to find a way to incentivize people to produce more goods to help close that gap and bring those two together. So we have our positive externalities. So when we think about these, one of the big areas that, so we talked about we've talked about technology a little bit, and we'll get more into technology as we go through. But before we do, what we're looking at first, and a nice little example to kind of introduce all that stuff, I think, is education. Um, or human capital. So we said, well, why would we as a society invest in it? Why not just say, well, everybody, if you can, go out, we're not going to have a education system. Just go out. If you choose to get educated, great. If you don't, great. Whatever you want to do, you can do. And by educated in this case, we can think of your K-12 education. We can think of grants or stuff like that. Whatever we want to think of, we can. But we're interested in here. Why do we invest in education or human capital? And when we think about it, education, it's an investment just like anything else, right? You have to come up upfront, you have to pay something, you have this cost that, maybe you don't necessarily know the outcome of your decision, but you have a cost to make and there's a risk associated with it, right? Maybe you go into a field and you pay for 4 semesters of college and then it just doesn't work out. In which case, maybe you're out $10,000 or whatever the case is, or maybe so maybe college doesn't work out or something like that, or maybe you go out, you get this degree, and now there are no jobs in that field, or maybe you were misguided into thinking that there were jobs in a certain field, right? Neither case can be the truth. Could happen, right? So we have this education, but it could come out to be a dud, right? And that's with anything, any kind of thing you make an investment in. Uh, there is that potential it doesn't pay out. So when we think about it on a private or so this is the risk to the individual, right? And I'll make a little note of that. Individual risk. So the next bit, when we think about as an individual, right? The goal of education, and I break it down into two things. You're in this class, or you're in education at all to do one of two things: either one, to have a higher salary, or two, to get a job that's more desirable for you, or some combination of the both, right? So maybe you're going into a field where you could make the same amount of money with a high school diploma, but you're going to something you enjoy doing more, so it's worth it to you because you're doing something you love. So in this case, when we think about what education should do for us, is that it's going to this higher level of education will hopefully increase our future productivity and our ability to earn. That is, if I'm more educated, I'm going to give a signal that I'm a harder worker, or I'm going to, uh, I'm going to have additional skills that I didn't previously have. Excuse me. So I have these new skills that I didn't have from graduating high school, or I know more stuff than I previously did. So by earning this education, I'm able to be more productive, and I'll have a higher ability to earn income. And then we expect, right? And before we came to college, right, we're all told, oh yeah, well, there's our uh, and in Indiana, we had a thing called College Go Week. But you have a thing, they say, well, if you only graduate from high school, you're going to make this much. If you graduate from college, you're going to make all this money, and so on, right? And overall, we expect to earn about 10 to 15% if you receive a college education compared to not. But all of these things so far that we're looking at are be called our private rates of return. That is, these are the rates, this is the benefit that goes mostly to the individual. That is, if an example they have is interest on a savings account, maybe you have your more related to our example, we have our um, increase in earnings, or just the value of a good. So the value of a good to you. That is the additional utility that this good maybe brings, right? So my private rate of return again, if something brings me a lot of utility, then I like it. If something doesn't, maybe I don't care for it as much, or maybe I'm less likely to make that purchase, or whatever the case is. It is. So we see our private rates of return. In education, it's I'm going to have more money. I'm going to have a job I like more. So between those two, I may choose to invest in my own personal education. But on the other side, we're going to see some gains to society. And I'm going to or I'll introduce this, then we'll kind of take a little bit of a curveball look at it and see where maybe the idea isn't 100% spot on. So when we think about what society gains, we'll see, hey, society does tend to benefit from investing. So on this side, what we're going to introduce is our social rate of return. And this is going to be the benefits that society receives from you getting an education. And in general, what we see is if you have an educated population, and by educated, we're not necessarily meaning you have to go and get your doctorate, or even you have to go and get your bachelor's degree, right? We can say that if you graduate from high school, uh, you could be considered educated, right? So whatever bar- barrier we want to put, we can put that there. But in general, if you are educated, uh, you are more likely, we're more likely to see better health outcomes for the population. That is people who are educated tend to take better tend to, big emphasis on the tend to. That is, there are people who are educated who don't take any personal care of themselves. There are people who are relatively uneducated who take great care of themselves. So don't take this the wrong way. Don't say, oh well, just I'm educated, so that means I take great care of myself. Not necessarily. But in general, those who are educated tend to make healthier decisions. Those who are educated tend to work along those lines. We also expect to see lower levels of crime. That is, I would expect, and again, not necessarily saying that this would happen, but uh, you would probably be more likely to expect to be, if you got robbed or something, you'd probably wouldn't expect a uh, you probably wouldn't expect to be robbed by a doctor, right? At least the traditional sense of robbery. Maybe your doctor has done some sketchy book work, but you would not expect to be robbed by a doctor. And if you saw in the news that, oh, a doctor robbed a gas station, meaning like a medical doctor, you'd probably be fairly surprised by that. You have this cleaner environment, so uh, in general, if those who have an education have a more maybe they have more efficient tools, more efficient toys to play with, so maybe they have a more efficient car, maybe their house is more efficient, and so on. And then this last one is a more stable government, or a democratic republic government. So again, if we think about different countries, where do we see stable governments versus where do we see unstable governments? And those countries that are developed, which have higher education, when you have a more educated population, we also tend to see these more stable governments. So when we think about this, right, we say, right, this is the benefits of schooling, this is that social rate of return. All of these, though, and not saying that being educated and educating your people don't help these, but there is another way that we could look at these. So when we think about all these benefits, we could say yes, it is education, but if we say it must be, so oops. So we're gonna see is we will see a fallacy with giving what we may say blind credit or sole credit to education. And there are going to kind of be two issues. Uh, there are going to be two issues that come up in this with this fallacy. And again, this is a little bit more just interesting. It's not like testable or anything like that. This is something that's interesting to think about. So, fallacy with this blind credit. The first thing that we'll see is that, or a couple ideas. So I'm going to say potentially one, education is a product of a more developed society. And that is having a high percentage of your population educated is maybe a product of, again, a more of a higher productive or a more productive society. So, whereas at first it seems like, well, we have to have people educated so that our society can be developed and so our society can be productive. I could very well take it and say, well, it's just the opposite of that. That is, we have educated people because our society is productive. And if we think about as we go through time, people become more and more and more educated. More people graduate high school. More people are getting college degrees than they did 100 years ago, and so on. But also, as we've gone through time, we have less people working in the farm. We have more people, working where the adults are providing income and the children are not. So today, and you may have where your kid maybe helps out at a business or something like that. But today, child labor is not legal, right? Your kid cannot earn income for your household. Uh, and just kind of something we see. Big thing we've seen is child labor has become illegal, and we've developed a compulsory education system. However, if we did this, say, 150 years ago, when you needed everybody in the world to help you work on the farm, it would have been a different story, right? Oh well, right, the whole idea of, oh well, our kids need to be in school instead of working on the farm, that wouldn't have worked in that previous time, because if the kids aren't working on the farm, then the farm work's not going to get done because there's too much to do for just the adults. So the first thing we can see is that education is potentially a product of this more productive society. But also, a second thing that we can see, so that being a product of more productive society, um, so with this more productive society, we'll also see a more stable government. And I just want to come back to those examples that they gave. So we have this more stable government, um, a cleaner environment, and uh, potentially lower level of crime. But I'm going to get to lower level of crime in a second. And this also leads to these better health outcomes. That is, even within the United States, uh, both your rich and your poor, you're educated and you're not educated, understand what is healthy and what isn't healthy. Right? I think there's a fairly common consensus across the board of health, and so on. So we see these with our more productive society. And the second note that we'll see, or the second note that I'm going to point out, um, is that The people who would get educated, and this is kind of going to follow that same line, but the people who would go and get educated are not likely to commit crime. So, with this, what we're saying to commit a crime. So, I'm saying with this is, and this is going to come from, and this will kind of be halfway there, halfway not. So, the first bit, just because I went and got an economics degree, did not that getting a degree did not prevent me from going out and robbing somebody. Right? That did not prevent me from getting a crime, from committing a crime. But instead, you might say that, well, I was not going to commit a crime anyway. Right? I would never have robbed anybody or killed anybody or anything like that anyway. So because I wouldn't have done that, uh, right, we can almost go to say that these two are almost unrelated. Right? That is, I have my personality. So maybe you have a certain personality, and a part of this personality is that you go out and you choose to get educated. But another part of this personality is that you do not commit crimes. So you're also not a criminal. So I'm getting at with this is these two are a product of you. And with your personality, you can argue nature or nurture, right? Maybe it's part of the way you were raised. Maybe it's a part of, how you're biologically inclined, whatever the case is. But just because I am the type who would go get educated, and I'm the type that says I'm not a criminal, does not necessarily mean that these two are linked. There could be a link, which we'll get to in a second, but it does not necessarily mean that they are linked. So, people who get educated are not likely to commit a crime. Uh, so, that is, again, with or without education. But the second part of this is going to be kind of a um, it's going to be kind of a little bit of a different thing. So these people also, they have higher wages, so they potentially are not as desperate. So with many people, when you think about a crime, right? So if I go out and I shoplift or I commit a crime, oftentimes it's not necessarily because I wanted to do it, but maybe it was out of necessity, or maybe it was out of, or maybe I'm able to justify it somehow. Whether that justification is proper or not, I within myself am able to do it. So I might say is, if I'm in a desperate situation, I may go out and say, well, if it's a matter of feeding my family or not, you might be a little more susceptible to going out shoplifting or robbing somebody. Just because, again, if it's a matter of feeding your family, uh, things can change. Your mentality can change, and your mindset can change. So, or saying here again, people who get educated, right? They are kind of prone to that, whether that be through nurture, nature, or whatever you believe. Um, but again, they would not commit a crime with or without education. And same thing, we can say the same thing about wages. That is, people who would get educated, excuse me, these people who would get educated would earn higher wages regardless. And the idea of this part is that education is going to be So in this case, what we're going to say is that education is going to be a signal of your work ethic. Okay. So what this is saying is education is not necessarily just, oh yeah, I went to college and I learned all this stuff and that makes me a good worker because I know all this stuff, right? Um, knowing about supply and demand in and of itself doesn't make you a better worker, right? And for a lot of fields, we can say this, right? And this, it's not necessarily saying, oh yeah, because of that you shouldn't get an education, but it's just the reality, right? There are certain things that you're going to pick up in school that you'll never use in work, and you'll never use after you graduate. However, what education does is it gives you the opportunity to say, well, I went through and I completed something, right? You have this big project. In this case, the project would be something like your associate's, your bachelor's, your master's, your doctorate degree, whatever this project is. And you say, hey, I went through and I I completed something, right? And as we're young, something where if you commit to something 2 to 4 years or 6, maybe even 8 years, it gives that strong sign that you're able to sit down, get something complete, and be a hard worker. Because, there are, when we think about your degree, there are some parts of it that are easy. There are other parts that are very difficult. Um, when you in getting your degree, uh, you work with a lot of different faculty members who operate things in different ways. That is, like in our class, everything's due on Monday nights. On maybe another class, they have things more sporadically scheduled out, or I do things a certain way, your other professors do things another way. And personally, I think that's a part of the benefit is that you work with a number of different people. You have potentially different policies on late work and all that. So, right, you kind of get this ability to manage potentially 5 or 6 different projects at one time, which is a part of that educational process. So even if you don't have to go out and say, well, even if you don't have to, tell your future boss what the externality is for an action you take, um, and even if you never use any of this stuff we've ever talked about ever again, you've been able to help manage these different projects and so on. And in this case, I don't have any projects, but you kind of get what I mean: the assignments, the tests, all that stuff, and managing that along with everything else you're doing right now. So this education, it is a signal of work ethic where you have people who they went out and they got stuff done, and people who have that work ethic are also, again, regardless of whether you had a education or not, you're probably likely to earn a higher wage than somebody who doesn't have that work ethic. Just because, if you're willing to put in the work, odds are you can make something happen. So you have these things again, and as I go through this, basically the overall logic of this is, it could very well be, and you don't have to take one way or the other, right? You can say that education does help contribute to these, but I don't think you'd want to say that education is the sole reason for this. So again, uh, the logical thing though to watch out for is if we have something where, suppose we're looking at this from a societal level, we have our productivity. As our productivity increases from this, we tend to see higher education. Then we tend to see a cleaner environment. And maybe we also tend to see lower crime, etc. That means lower crime. I should just leave the arrow out. I should leave the arrow out in here. So as we have a more productive society, we tend to see all these things. But just because, right? So if we think about this not on the education route, So productivity leads to a cleaner environment, and higher productivity leads to lower crime. But does a cleaner environment lead to lower crime? Maybe not necessarily, right? And same thing with education. We could say, uh, does that education lead to a cleaner environment, or does that education lead to lower crime? Maybe, maybe not. But remember, we don't. It's not. This is not going to be an all or nothing deal, right? We could say that a lower crime is maybe lower crime rate is something like 40% contributed to our increase in productivity, 50% to education, and then 10% to you know, maybe to more opportunities outside of either of those two, right? And I'm just throwing something out there, but right, we can say, well, there's partial attributions to a certain thing, and we're allowed to do that as well. Remember, one of the overarching themes of that we've taken throughout the class is I don't necessarily have to. When we think about econ, I don't have to go and pick just one thing. I can kind of take it as a buffet where I can take a little of this, a little of that, and so on. So again, we have our social rate of return, and these are those, those the total. Uh, excuse me. It's just that total benefit that we see. So again, this will include, and right now we're thinking more about what's going to society, not necessarily to the individual, but when we think about social, again, social, I am a part of society, you are part of society. So these are potential spillovers, right? So we have our two things. Why I would go pursue an education, and why society will invest in that. And one before I move on, just one more little thing. So when you think about this productivity, right, we could potentially see this part as a two-way street. That is in kind of a chicken and egg situation where we had to have somebody had to come up and get some initial productivity built so that we can have this education system. But also, once the education system is built, you have to keep people educated in order to continue that productivity. That is, if you have a population where nobody knows how to do anything, that productivity will not continue. So this part right here is kind of a two-way street. So when you think about what kind of policy are we looking for, right? And so whereas before with our negative externalities, we said we wanted to get people to produce less of a good. That is, we wanted the next externality to go down, and we want to make people responsible for the externality they produce. So in this case, instead of punishing firms or people for producing their goods, now we want to encourage them, or we want to actually help them create the positive externality. And to do that, we'll give them a share of the social benefit. So our policy goal, again, the overall goal is to give these people a social benefit. So again, the overall idea is to close the gap between our social outcome and our market outcome. And this can be done in a couple tools that we may see to do this. Give me just a second. So a couple tools that we may see before we get into the intellectual property rights. A couple tools before the intellectual property rights is going to be, well, one, we have our intellectual. I'm just going to throw them in because we're about to do them. We have those. Then we also may see something like a subsidy, right? So basically, this is the opposite of a tax, where the government pays for pays for or partially for a good. And we mentioned before, we mentioned the essential air service back in our chapter on when we were talking about the airlines and we were talking about deregulation. So your small cities, meaning your smaller cities, are still served by airlines, but they're going to be subsidized because if they were to operate at cost or at cost to consumers, nobody would be able to afford them and they wouldn't be able to make a profit. So we see these subsidies come in where government helps pay for a good, and the idea again, we're not going to subsidize something unless it has some benefit to the community. And with the in this case, we're talking about the airports. In this case, the airports they bring they bring some benefit to the community, so they choose to subsidize them. In terms of education, you receive subsidies in the sense of grants or in the sense of tax breaks. So you have things like the Hope Credit and stuff like that, where if you're depending on your overall financial situation, you're able to write off your education expenses on your taxes. Similarly, we say, well, education has all these benefits, and if you just graduated high school or if you're younger, uh, odds are if you're getting an education, you don't have a bunch of money in savings right up front. There's a really decent chance. So what we do is we want to make it where we want to make the education system approachable to everybody, rich and poor. So we have these subsidies to help people out and give them maybe the little boost they need to actually motivate them to go to school or to make it where finances are less of an issue. So these kind of two tips: intellectual property, subsidies. We could have tax credits as well, right? So if a large company is looking to move to a new town or new city, we'll see that cities will actually make bids to get them there. So recently, Amazon was looking with their second headquarters. Um, Amazon was looking at building a second headquarters, and in order to make that happen, in order to make that happen, they had to, excuse me, in order to happen, one of the things that we saw come up was cities were offering them tax breaks and subsidies and all that good stuff. And what the cities were saying is, hey, if you come to our town, we'll give you a tax break. And the idea being that when they come to town, they're going to create more jobs. When they create more jobs, wages will increase, more people will work, more people will come to town. But also, you may see additional businesses come into town as well. So in this case, Amazon creates a new office and they pick New York. I don't like that they picked New York because New York has a lot going for it already. But suppose they decided to open up an office in, say, Fort Dodge, Iowa, right? And I picked Fort Dodge because it's a little further away from Des Moines. Um, they're kind of out there a little bit, like Fort Dodge or Mason City. So they decide to open up an office there. Two things are going to happen. One, either one of those cities are going to take off because they're going to have flights that need to come in and out to do business with them. But also, since there is this new large business that's bringing people to either Fort Dodge or Mason City or somewhere like that, because that's coming in, you're going to see new businesses come in to serve the people who are moving in to work for Amazon. So in this case, again, we have the initial transaction was Amazon buys a building and people go to work for Amazon. But because of that, extra people come in to provide services for those people who got jobs, and uh, more flights are going to be coming in and out. So maybe some tourist stuff comes up because of this, and so on and so on. So we have those tools that we'll look at, and again, the idea is to make the marginal benefit more closer to the marginal cost. And on a Wednesday, what we'll get into is our government's actually encouraging innovation and what tools do they have to take innovation into here. And for these, what we're going to be looking at is really 3 tools to actually promote innovation itself. The first is going to be our intellectual property rights. So we have things like patents, copyright laws, trademarks. One of the things we saw, one of the things we saw in the monopoly chapter, but also maybe the government will assist with costs of research and development. So with this, we have things like grants that will come into play. And again, we'll dive more into these on Wednesday. And the third thing is maybe the government will help facilitate research ventures between universities and companies. So in this case, universities are public or government run. So your universities team up with the company to help provide research. On Wednesday, what we'll see is why are these necessarily kind of necessary? So why don't companies just go out and do innovation themselves? And we'll look at these other 2 situations and see how all that works. And then we'll introduce our public goods. So we talked about them at the beginning of last week when we were talking about our different types of goods. When we look at public goods, we'll see why won't the market produce them like we would hope? Why would the market not just produce these public goods? And we'll see why that is, and why in some instances we have goods that are run by the state, managed by the state, and so on. So that's what we get into on Wednesday, and that's going to be the end of this video for today.